Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Well, and welcome to the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. I'm your host, Matthew Hawkins, along with my co host, Ed Carbajal. And on a weekly basis, we plan to bring you the biggest news and interviews in the world of combat sports. Ed, earlier on a Sunday morning, got a special guest. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm actually excited to speak with Mr. Daly, author Lee Daly here. He's got a book that he's going to have coming out in the fall. It's about the history. It's called The Fall of History of Pride Fighting Championships. Mr. Lee Daly, how are you, sir? All the way from Dublin.
Thanks very much, guys. Yep, all the way from Dublin, Ireland. I've got a slight cold, so I don't always sound this deep, but I guess it's good for radio. So, yeah, thanks very much for having me.
No problem. So, I mean, this was kind of a unique find for me. I had to tell Matt in the middle of the day after we started following each other on Twitter. Your book just popped up at me, and I feel bad that there's 13 days left for the Indiegogo. I'm like, I wish I found it sooner because me and Matt, almost every episode we've recorded for this podcast, we mentioned something about Pride Fighting Championships. I mean, if you look, I'm wearing. I mean, I know people on the audio version won't be able to see it, but I put on my Pride Fighting. This is ordered direct from Pride when they were still afloat, like from
Wow.
Japan. And
Awesome.
Matt's got all his Pride stuff in the background there. So we're really excited to talk about somebody that took 2 years of his time to research and interview folks associated with the promotion. I don't know if Matt wants to jump in, and I mean, I would imagine you guys are going to go back and forth a lot because we're just such big fans of Pride and everything that they've done over the years before they had to shut down.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the days of sneaking on a buddy's computer before I had the internet and trying to find any information I could about, just hearing the rumored events from Japan and seeing all the names. I mean, at the time, basically, when you had Hoist Gracie kind of name started floating around again, it became something that I became hugely interested in 1997. Lee, what was it about Pride that made you want to write a book about them?
Well, I think you guys are, you kind of hit it on the head there, Matt. When it very much took me back to the early days of my fandom. And how I got into Pride was I came across it through Tape Trading Network back based off the sort of old Japanese pro wrestling tape trading when I was a teenager. And it really was such a different time, and I think you had to go out of your way to try find stuff like Pride. And that was what I think really attracted me to it, was just how sort of crazy and exotic it seemed, And looking back at it at the time, and this is one of the major themes in the book too. Pride was the premier mixed martial arts organization for pretty much most of its existence. I think towards the end, obviously there were things that sort of started to defray it in terms of being that organization, but in terms of the biggest fighters, the best fights, the most exciting fights, I don't think by any measure really you could say that Pride wasn't the biggest, more or less from its infancy up until it died about a decade after it was founded. So for me, in terms of my personal motivation for the book, I mean, I'm a fan like you guys, and I think, for me, when I kept seeing that there was no sort of comprehensive history of the promotion, that kind of was something where I assumed, okay, maybe at some point somebody will write it. But at a certain point, I just decided, well, why not me? I've written sort of sports columns and written on other topics before, so it was something that I felt I could tackle and tackle well. And that's the thing as well to talk about the Indiegogo. And this thing is, I think I am asking sort of the mixed martial arts community to take a bit of a leap of faith. But one thing I will attest to is I think the passion that I have and all the fans have for the promotion comes out in the book. And I think that's something I'm personally willing to give my guarantee and my promise that when people get their hands on the book, they will see that it's a very high quality product.
So did you have a hard time getting in touch? I know you have interviews and you got to speak with Boss Rutan and Stephen Quadros, the guys that are pretty much known as the voices of Pride, along with Moro and a bunch of other people. But like, did you have a hard time getting in touch with them? How did you arrange the interviews? I mean, were they difficult? Were they open? How was that whole experience?
Well, I can't say enough nice words about Stephen and Boss. Just couldn't be nicer guys. Boss gave me an hour of his time and was very open to it, and Stephen as well. Stephen actually was an email interview, but he still like answered everything like really comprehensively, and they were really awesome. Yeah, look, it was a challenge getting access. I think somebody who's worked on and been a journalist for years sort of maybe would have had more of the context that I had, but I sort of was pretty determined again to make it a decent project, and also part of it forced me to maybe talk to people that I think maybe people wouldn't expect. People like Minoru Suzuki, who founded Pancras before, we were one of the forerunners for Pride. People like Eric Paulson, obviously involved in Shudo, another one of the forerunners of Pride. And I think there's an entire book there that could be written on each of those promotions in and of themselves. And, that's really kind of the approach that I took, And the other thing to say as well is, even with those interviews that I did have, I went to pains to look at the existing interviews that they'd already done, the existing articles, because there is quite a few good ones, I think, that have been done throughout the years, and decided to try cover some fresh ground. So there's some really interesting stuff there. I think one of the interesting things that I managed to catch was about the Mark Coleman fight against Takada, where, I think Coleman at one or two points admitted that the fight wasn't maybe on the level. I think I'm not sure of his exact stance now, but I think he has, he's not as keen to talk about it maybe as he had been in the past. I think it's understandable. But Boss actually told me, and something that I think I hadn't seen before, because he did talk about it in Joe Rogan, was there was actually a fax sent that said that the fight would be a work. So I don't know if they kind of, because this is in the very early days, I think, when it was, they were kind of, they were promoting in a certain way, and that's kind of what happened. So just little stuff like that. I think there's enough little sort of tidbits in there, along with building from the existing articles, books that have been written. I think building a very comprehensive story, and I'm pretty proud of it, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, one of the things that comes up when I get into conversations with other MMA fans, and usually I'm defending Pride. While it existed, it was, I love the UFC, but the Pride was the spectacle that I looked forward to every 6-8 weeks or so when it would air. Was the fixed matches. Now we know historically most people talk about the like you said, the Coleman Takada fight. I believe there might be one or two other ones that are kind of known, usually involving Takada.
The other big one was Kyle Sturgeon against Takada. So Kyle Sturgeon was a guy who trained with Chemo. He had never had a fight before that. He's not had a fight since. And if you look at the fight, I think it's fair to say, like, there's one point where he knocks down Takada and then backs away to the far side of the ring. And, it's very much not on the level. And I think the other one, is Ogawa, and I can't remember the name of his opponent, but that's the other one I think that's largely seen as maybe as not being on the level. But sorry, I have more to say on that, but please go ahead. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was kind of going to ask you, because I always bring up the fact that there was also, pretty much known a couple fixes in early UFC as well, or at least a throne fight. Macias and Tektarov at UFC 6, Mark Hall, Don Fry, Ultimate, is pretty widely known as a work, at least. I trained with Mark Hall, and he explained the situation to me shortly after the time. Fry doesn't admit it, but I think that's because Don Fry is Don Fry and pretty stuck in his ways and stuff like that. But and then they had the Vitor Joe Charles match, which was basically decided that they weren't going to punch each other, and it became a grappling match when it was obviously signed to be a MMA fight. Was there anything else you came across? I saw recently someone claiming that the Crow Cop Dos Caros fight was actually a work when he got blasted, and people claiming he had a blood packet in his mask and stuff like that. I thought it was ridiculous, because no one would ever agree to take a head kick and a straight shot from Crow Cop. So, I could see a reaction to that one. But did you come across anything else that might have looked fishy? Or I just always get interested when people bring up that, that to hold it against Pride, when pretty much every organization that came about in the 90s had some moments of shadiness that, and it seemed to me, like you said, Pride was the most open about it as all the other organizations, considering it came from the pro wrestling world.
Yeah, well, I'll preface this with one thing, which I think is people are very caught up in a simple binary of it's either a fix or it's a shoot, and actually that ignores the vast different amount of things you can do to favor what I would say is have a certain outcome. right? For instance, you can have pro wrestling matches where the outcome is known, but the guys are going to hit each other full force. You can have a mixed martial arts fight where obviously it's pretty much on the level. You can have one, and this is where I think the interesting stuff with Pride comes about, and this is fairly well documented. Is things like telling one guy that he would be fighting a certain opponent in 6 weeks' time, and then telling his opponent 2 weeks out that you're fighting this guy, and obviously having to prepare and cut weight and do all this sort of other different stuff at short notice was a real significant difference. Something like Pancras was pretty interesting because both Bas Rutten and Frank Shamrock kind of admitted that look, there were certain gentleman rules that applied, and also they admitted that there were certain fights maybe where and again, this comes back to the subtlety of how many different things you can do. Frank Shamrock said, there's guys he fought that he likes to think that he beat, but he's not necessarily sure that he did, So with something like Dos Caras Jr., I mean, like, here's the thing, right? If Dos Caras Jr. Or Alberto Del Rio, as he's also known, or Alberto El Patron, I think is his current moniker, is like, at the end of the day, if you put those two into a pure shoot fight, pretty likely someone like Crow Cup would beat him anyway. And that comes back to, well, what is the intent of the organizers there? It's probably just the same as it would have been if they'd worked the match anyway, right? Like, this is a guy who he's going to likely beat. So, I think that whole debate needs to really kind of, people need to acknowledge that there's a whole spectrum of stuff that can happen. And also the fact that within professional sports, I mean, allegedly there's a World Cup match that was fixed. There's allegedly a lot of different dodgy stuff that goes on in a lot of different sports. So I think that, and again, this is one of the themes of the book, is the UFC kind of has managed to make its money and make it sustainable and turn itself into a 4 billion or 7 billion, if you believe Dana White's latest comments, business off the idea that it's a legitimate sport because it separated itself out from WWF and so on and so forth. But if you look at it, really, I think what happened with Pride was it was entertainment mixed with sports. So I think it's probably fair enough to call it sports entertainment in that sense. And for me, Josh Barnett put this pretty well, I think, when he talked about the CM Punk fight. For me, I'm not always that concerned. I wouldn't say, obviously, I do want things to be on the level, but when it comes to kind of an entertainment spectacle and this kind of stuff, that's kind of what we come for. That's kind of why we enjoy it. And really, that's why, as much as we might bemoan some of these fights, that's what we enjoy too. So I think I'm a little more at peace with myself than maybe the average MMA fan is over that kind of stuff.
What about the? I mean, I don't know if the book goes into, because there's obviously a lot of accusations about, as far as like testing for drugs and stuff. And I remember actually one of the special features of the DVDs had Boss going backstage with the guys' urine in cups on the table, showing that they do test and stuff like that, because that was something they had to defend themselves against when they were still afloat. Does your book touch on any of that?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, this is a topic where I'll have to admit, most of it's based on, and again, coming back to, what I'm pretty proud of. It's most of it's based on stuff that's in the public record, and there was testing, for instance, where they would do tests. Some of them, for instance, I can't remember who the fighter was actually, but they did say, like, that they did take urine samples, but they weren't necessarily handled in the proper way. Again, like, as we've seen, like, there's really so many different ways to, even if you do test, for the test to be, a certain way or what have you. And look, I think it's fair to say that, yeah, I mean, there wasn't maybe the most strictest of organizations with regards to drug testing. Frank Trigg actually puts it pretty well in the book, where when he's talking about what sort of one of the factors that kind of meant that the Pride fighters maybe didn't do as well in the UFC as they had done in Pride was that different testing regime. Yeah. Because even if you are testing, for instance, if you tell everybody, well, we're gonna test you on fight night, people can cycle on or cycle off. But if you have a UFC, and even before the USADA regime, I think it's fair to say the UFC did have, and the athletic commissions did have, a more stringent testing regime. Having to change what you're doing severely affects your performance. And I think we saw that as well. Like, remember in 2013 when there was sort of the exemptions on TRT were gotten rid of. We saw that change too. So look, I think it's fair to say that Pride overall did not have the most stringent of testing, even where it did test. And for a large amount of time, I think initially, like if you've seen the Smashing Machine, the Mark Carey documentary, they say that we're not going to drug test you. It's actually said during the rules meeting. So I think that whatever regime they eventually did put in place, I think it's not uncontroversial to say it maybe wasn't as stringent as the USADA testing rules and those kind of things we see now.
Yeah, from what I understood, they mainly would test for like recreational drugs more than anything, and kind of let the performance enhancing ones slide by. I do think that it's kind of a change in history though when people kind of think about the UFC didn't really have much drug testing either. I mean, they didn't really start it as far as I can really remember until it became legal in Vegas in 2001. So that was already about 4.5 years or so, 5 years into Pride of their 10-year existence. And then, the first drug test I can remember failed is UFC 36 was Josh Barnett against Randy Couture. Now, I know he had been warned before, so, for testing positive at UFC 34 against Bobby Hoffman. But, there wasn't none of the people really from the Pride era that were champions in UFC really thrived after about 2007, 2008, when Pride was absorbed and it became kind of a more of a stringent drug testing level across the board. Once USADA kicked in, pretty much everybody from that era has faded away. From Vitor Belfort to, Chuck Liddell's career didn't end well. Tito Ortiz, but I don't consider him a drug cheat. That guy passed probably as many tests as anybody else in the history of MMA. But it's just one of those things. I think it's one. If you're a UFC fan or you grew up watching MMA in the last 10 years, that's kind of one of your go-tos to try to act like the UFC was always the top dog in the world of MMA.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't know if you want to come in there, but yeah, look, the other thing as well, it's like I think some of this comes back to just being a little bit self-critical. Like I think one of the problems with MMA sometimes in MMA fandom is because it's been such a creation of the television era, and because the UFC in particular has placed such a emphasis on its brand, people sometimes have a reluctance to be critical, and I don't think that should be the case. I think that, again, it's a sport, it's something where people should be able to voice dissenting opinion and should be able to look at things critically. And yeah, for me, like I said, there's plenty of other sports as well that have issues that are people deny. And for MMA, yeah, those issues exist too. And I think we need to look at them critically and keep doing so. I think with Pride, it's a good example to look back on, I think, and say, okay, well, this is what it looked like when it was a bit more like the Wild West. And truth be told, maybe that's not something we necessarily want to return to in that certain respect,
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that 100%. The other thing too is that I wanted to ask you was as far as your research and everything you did for the book, what's one of the interviews or facts that you discovered that sat with you the most, that made you think, oh my God, I can't believe this happened, that's in the book, without doing any too much spoilers, but if you could just drop a hint or something. I mean, that just because of the whole history of the promotion, I think we all, Matt and I especially, on our side of the globe, when we found out Pride was going to disappear, we were kind of like, how could this happen,
So I think two things. I think one would be in terms of in-ring stuff. I remembered Bas Rutten, I think it's the Total Elimination 2003 card. I can't quite remember, but it's the third fight between Sakuraba and Silva. And during kind of a skit, Bas Rutten says that Sakuraba should probably retire if he gets knocked out, which is really, really kind of quite profound thing to say, I think, before a fight. This guy should retire if he gets knocked out, which is, in fairness to Boss, he's a straight shooter. That's what his opinion was. And when I asked him when he said that, the reason why, and it is up on social media, this quote, like he said basically that he really liked Sakuraba. He thought he was a good guy, and he felt that he had been sort of milked somewhat. And like at that point, he would have fought Crow Cop. He would have fought I think he would have fought Randleman maybe as well at that stage, like guys that were, much bigger than him, and acquitted himself really well, I think, a lot of those cases. But he was taking an awful lot of damage, and I think that's one of those things where even the guy that was kind of basically their golden goose and their biggest star, the fact that they couldn't treat him well, I think it's, that does say a lot, The second thing I think is, and one thing again that I'm quite proud of, is the kind of the sort of explanation of what exactly happened towards the end of Pride.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that in business terms, maybe it wouldn't have always been the most sustainable anyway, because it was such a supernova in Japan. It became very hot very quickly. And then I think over time, particularly after, I think, the Fedor and Crow Cop fight, where they just discovered that Fedor really was just the best, and probably no one would be able to beat him. I think maybe you could argue there would have been some fall off in interest, but really maybe what meant that there was no real transition towards something else, or even a consolidation, was the crazy antics in terms of, and the crazy accusations that were flying about in terms of the involvement of Yakuza. I'm fair to say, I'm happy to say, I don't know what happened. I don't think anybody can ever truly say hand on heart that they know what happened, but there is certainly enough stuff there on the public record that suggests that it was some pretty crazy business arrangements that happened. I think the most instructive thing to look at, and I summarize it in the book, is the UFC ordered a due diligence report on Pride when they were purchasing the assets, and attempting to purchase the Dream Stage Entertainment, the holding company behind Pride.
Mm-hmm.
And basically just went through a lot of different issues, just solely in terms of the actual, forgetting about the Yakuza stuff, but just the actual kind of due diligence administration that just really blew your mind, like the chief accountant resigning and then showing up at a meeting the next day, and just stuff like that, which for me, it just is really, really kind of crazy. So I think that's interesting. And one or two people I've sort of given a preview of the book have said, yeah, that was really interesting to me, and that really illuminated it for me. Because I think at the time, it's not something people necessarily would have been able to take in. But I think over time now, and we have things like the Mijatovic interview. This is the Crow Cop's former manager in 2012, I think it was, with Spike TV, where he went through a few of the details. And there's a little more stuff now where I think we can reflect and write, the history of the promotion, and I think people can look back on it and go, wow, that's what really happened, or come to some approximation of what happened.
One of the things that I always thought was kind of led to the downfall of Pride, when it all was said and done, was really the lack of a heavier weight Japanese champion. Other than Takanori Gomi, who pretty much thrived on the Bushido level for Pride, that's what led to a lot of the so-called squash matches or kind of can matches, is because it seemed like Pride was always trying to get a Japanese fighter, even if they were nowhere near the level of the competition, to try to win a title or beat one of the top guys in Pride, whether it was Ogawa or Yoshida or Takada. I know Otsuka beat Marco Huas early on, but that was kind of before they were established, and that was another fight that was can be kind of looked at slightly questionable, although Huas says he was just really sick and shouldn't have been fighting anyway. What do you think that played into it, as far as never getting Sakuraba over the hill, or not getting Yoshida getting that big win, or not having anybody anywhere near the ballpark of Fedor, when you got Fujita and guys like that?
I think if you look at the record of these guys, I think I would sort of single out, I think, Yoshida and Fujita in particular. I think Ogawa, his problem was, the guys he beat weren't, he wasn't able to really seriously beat anyone of any real weight. I think Yoshida, sort of beat a few guys, I think Don Fry actually at one point, and Fujita also kind of had good victories over Mark Kerr and this kind of stuff. But none of them had the kind of what Sakuraba had, which was obviously the series over the Gracies, but I think more importantly, the victory over Hoist, which really put him over the top, I think. And just at that point, after that, he could win or lose, I wouldn't say more or less freely, but he was a made man from that point of view. So yeah, I think you're right. It's Fujita and Yoshida. Neither of them quite got the victory. I think for Yoshida, that real moment was that first fight against Silva. And actually asked Bas Rutten about this, and he said, yeah, look, that was the big win he needed, and he didn't quite get it, So I think that was a part of the problem, was, and if you look at that fight, the crowd reactions are insane. The crowd is really going well for Yoshida. If you look at the rematch, yeah, they're still into it, but I don't think they quite believe that he could win, So I think that it's one of those things where it just didn't quite click. And the other thing as well is, and this goes back to kind of one thing I think mixed martial arts fans, I hope, will get out of the book is the nature of Japanese MMA, and the fact that it did have such close relationships with pro wrestling, where I think they were trying to construct stars. You know, like I know Ogawa was someone, for instance, he had the Olympic experience just like Yoshida did. You know, and they were ready-made stars that, you know, if they were serious, that you could really launch them into the mainstream. But you someone like Sakuraba, who became probably, you know, he became their biggest star, and he's a complete happy accident because he left. He was a high level college, you know, high school wrestler, but you know, he didn't have that pedigree at all. And actually, if you look at him, you know, he's a pretty laid back guy. You know, he's not especially, I would say, like traditionally charismatic, but he does have a charisma in other ways. That was the problem, was I think that they were looking for a template for someone who could make it big, and they never quite found that person, you know. And part of that was because, you know, and actually Pride did admit this, and I think Asaka Hibara himself admitted this. That's the president of Pride from 2003 onwards, and the current promoter of Ryzen. He did admit that you know, Sakuraba was kind of a happy accident, you know, and they got lucky with that. I think their big problem was, you know, they tried to build people and it just didn't happen for various reasons, you know.
The thing you mentioned just now about mixing pro wrestling and MMA, I feel like that's still something that an argument that comes up a lot. I mean, when you look at the recent with Daniel Cormier and Brock Lesnar walking in the ring, that's a lot of fighters are bringing that up too and mixing it up. But it's something that the formula works, and if Pride started it, then they should get credit for that. But I mean, you can say what you will about rankings and competition and stuff, but the fact of the matter is, when it comes to the business side, I mean, the formula always works. I mean, look at the hype around that when it happened, and then you mentioned, look at guys like that do a lot of trash talk, like Conor McGregor, Colby Covington, all those guys. I mean, it's something that comes from that's from sports entertainment. So and ultimately, it is entertainment for folks. I mean, not everybody trains. You know, not everyone's getting, you know, gets those 6 degrees of separation between fighter and fan and stuff like we do, but it's still something that works. One thing I want to ask your opinion, Lee, about is the and Matt and I have talked about this on a lot of episodes. What do you think about when the UFC, you know, bought the Pride from Dream Stage, and when they fell apart? Why didn't they keep like the themes and everything going? Me and Matt always mentioned, like, why didn't you just still keep using the logos, keep using the, you know, the music or something? I mean, I think the best thing we got was when they fought in Japan and Rampage walked into the Pride music. That was the closest nostalgia. Like, why didn't they bank on the nostalgia of Pride fans, being that they bought them? What was your opinion on how the purchase was handled?
I mean, I think the record is pretty clear on why they didn't continue to keep Pride as a going concern in Japan, was because they had difficulties getting TV deals. The staff, I think there was issues with cooperation from the staff even after Saki Kibara left. And Dana White, you know, said a lot of comments like to the effect of, you know, they don't want me over there. They don't want another mixed martial arts promotion over there. So I think that's why they didn't keep it alive in that sense. Yeah, I think keeping the brand and keeping the sort of, if you were like kind of reconstituting Pride, whether it's, you know, in somewhere like Macau or whether it would be somewhere in the United States or what have you. Yeah, look, I mean, I think that could be something that could happen when they would be sort of, you know, sort of competing with themselves or that kind of thing. But, you know, I think only they can answer that. And my honest opinion, I think, is, and they've admitted that the WWF was a big template for them. If you look at it, and this is, again, something I say in the book, they acquired all different promotions, you know, stuff like Strikeforce. I mean, even Strikeforce, you could argue they probably could have kept going because that had pretty good exposure. Yeah. But it was all to, I think, build the UFC as the brand. That was what they wanted to do. I think it also it kind of was a case of removing leverage from fighters, so they only had one real viable place to go, and you know, subsuming everything into the UFC. And now that's what they do. And I think that's why it's such a viable property and such an amazing property, because they have done what, you know, boxing can't do, whereas they have a sport that's basically, you know, entirely within their remit and within their control, certainly at the professional level. So I think that's two reasons why. I think one, because in Japan it wasn't really viable, and two, because their goal has always been to build the UFC brand, and that's what's gotten them. That's what made the Fertittas very rich and what's made Dana White very rich. And, you know, that's, you can't argue with the results, I guess. And that's,
yeah.
Yeah. Jumping back to the pro wrestling thing real quick. you know, most people know that the Pride kind of came off the heels of the UWF and Pancrase. Did you come across, you know, and the pro wrestling in Japan at those times is a lot different than the pro wrestling. You know, I'm no expert on Japanese pro wrestling, but everything I've seen, it's much different than what we see today in WWE. You know, guys like Minoru Suzuki, I think even Ken Shamrock did it. Don Fry. I mean, you had real martial artists and a much more competitive kind of pro wrestling match, as far as, you know, legit looking strikes and submission holds, and it wasn't all just the classic Roddy Piper sleeper hold and stuff like that, you know, kind of was going on at the same time in the United States. When I mentioned I trained with Mark Hall, who was one of the early UFC pioneers. He competed when I was training with him. He would fly to Japan and compete in an event called Kingdom. It was Kingdom Pro Wrestling, and I have a couple bootleg tapes where he has matches against Sakuraba and Yoji Anjo, and I think Anthony Macias might be in some of them. And it's been so long. Did you come? That's one organization where there's very, very little information on. I think there's maybe a half a paragraph in Wikipedia about that. Did you come across that organization at all in your research?
Not so much Kingdom, and the reason why maybe I didn't pay as much attention to Kingdom as maybe I should have was it had a very short lifespan, and it was founded by Takada and his crew after the fall of what would have been the third UWF or UWFI. Are you guys getting an echo, by the way? I'm getting a slight one, but can you hear it now?
No.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Sorry. Yeah, no, Kingdom I wouldn't be certain on, but Kingdom was certainly a continuation of that UWF style. The whole sort of it, and again, the early chapters of the book, I do spend a lot of time talking about the different promotions that came out, because what happened in Japan was you had a tension between people that sort of wanted to do pro wrestling for real, by either which I mean use legitimate moves with fixed outcomes, or actually transition to entirely sort of you know, shoot matches with pro wrestling skills. I think that came from the influence of in Japan, basically you had a belief that the toughest guys in the world came from Wigan and the Snake Pit and catch wrestling. So guys like Billy Robinson, Carl Gotch, these kind of guys, that was who that they saw were kind of, and part of it I think came from Inoki, because Antonio Inoki, you know, Japanese pro wrestling legend, he introduced these guys as people he would go up against and kind of fight, because that was his mentality, was pro wrestling needed to be as real as it could be. So that was the genesis of it for a lot of it. And then in the 80s, what you had was a lot of the new generation really wanting to get into that reality-based sort of professional wrestling, whereas there was an obvious tension between sort of what you would understand as kind of being entertainment-based wrestling. And even that style is kind of different to what we'd understand in WWF then or now. So, yeah, the UWF had a real impact, I think, on the whole rise of Pride. And at the very start of the book, what I do is I sort of bring the traditions of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I think more broadly speaking, kind of catch wrestling and Japanese wrestling. And the very first Pride was a collision of the two. And yeah, that's kind of, I think, a narrative that really kind of, you know, was one that interested me, I think, and that's what form the book takes. But yeah, Kingdom was really interesting, and it was a continuation of the UWF style. And actually, to be honest, there's a few calls now. Josh Barnett has made a few sort of rumblings about it, and I think Davey Boy Smith Jr., who's the British Bulldogs son, they've talked about doing.
My headphones have gone, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear you. Okay, cool.
But one of the things. Oh, I'm now getting bounced back though.
Yeah, okay. All right. Let me see. My headphones. Yeah.
They unplugged. Oh.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
One of the things I wanted to ask, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Okay.
Okay. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was the you mentioned Ryzen. I always refer to Ryzen as the new Pride. what do you think about the guys that have carried over? I mean, obviously, like Crow Cop just got announced. He's fighting on September 30th, I think, over at Horizon 13, and it's obviously a lot of the same people running Ryzen now that were involved with Pride. I mean, do you think sometimes like Jake Ellenberger just retired last night? Do you think people with when their records hit the 30s and stuff, that as far as like the accumulated wins, do you think guys like Crow Cop and all these guys that are still coming over from the Pride era still fighting in Ryzen now should hang it up, or is it a detriment to the sport, or something to be admired still? I mean, I can't help but get excited when those guys fight, but I'm nostalgic like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a distinction here between what should happen and maybe what does happen. And you know, I think I'm in the same boat as you. Yeah, it does interest and intrigue some of these guys, but you know, like I think really when we look at it, we look at the likes of sort of Gary Goodridge or Mark Coleman, who physically are in very poor health. And look, part of it was that they did fight too long. I think for Ryzen, and yeah, if you see the likes of, I went to a card actually in 2017, and Crow Cop was fighting on it. Fujita was on it. The real sort of amazing one for me was Heath Herring fought, because he was stepping in as a last minute replacement for Roy Nelson. And he hadn't fought in maybe 6 or 7 years. And he got an incredible reaction from the crowd. So I think it's a problem where the real issue is, and Frank Craig, who comments on Ryzen, said this, you know, part of the problem, I think, is some of the new stars, finding them and having them train in Japan and become stars in Japan is a real challenge for the promotion, you know. And I think in an ideal world, they would be able to transition away from those guys. But they feel like they probably can't, they can't quite do that. Look, for me, I think I would be okay with you know, kind of new guys coming along and taking up the mantle. But yeah, look, it's a problem where the guys you grew up with are always the ones you remember most fondly. And to be honest, like, it's something Bellator maybe is doing as well, where Bellator have some really great fighters, people that are in their prime. You know, whether it's the likes of Rory McDonald or what have you. But you know, they're also, you know, they're relying on some of the older guys as well, like the likes of Wanderlei or Rampage, who, yeah, to be frank, I don't think probably should be fighting. But that's what draws too. So yeah, it's a should. They shouldn't really be doing it, but like I said, MMA is about spectacle. It is about excitement, and it's about buzz. And you know, as long as that's the case, that, you know, we will see people fight for too long. You know, they'll fight for longer than they have to, really.
Yeah. You just mentioned Fedor. What do you think about Fedor fighting in Bellator's heavyweight tournament? I mean, that's part of that nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean, the incredible thing is, like, on the one hand, he kind of has a pretty decent record for the last few years, which is kind of crazy. Like, you know, whether it's the Matt Mitrione fight or these kind of things where, look, yeah, he'll lose a few. He'll get some victories too, and really he's able to push guys. And I'm actually kind of intrigued by this fight. You know, I think Chael said that he keeps, you know, and one of the reasons why I think he was able to beat Wanderlei was Chael has kept training, you know, into his 40s. Whereas I think Wanderlei has, and you look at someone like Rampage, I think it's fair to say that, you know, Rampage wasn't in the best physical shape either. With this, it's a really interesting one where it's who is degraded down the worst, you know, and what sort of physical shape are they in. I know it's awful and it's terrible to have to factor that in, but that's where I think the intrigue does come from a fight like this. But obviously, once this fight is done, then that's it. You know, I think you're just into ever more diminishing returns, you know, and it's certainly something I'm going to be interested in. But, you know, I think it's at that point, it probably is time to for both of them maybe to look at calling it a day, you know.
Yeah.
You mentioned there you go. You mentioned that you got to go to a Ryzen show. I was lucky enough to go to Pride 32 here in the U.S. when actually Fedor was the headliner. Did you ever get a chance to go to any Pride shows during their time?
No, I was in college actually for the US shows, and I would have been far too young, I think, for the initial Japanese shows. I was maybe 15 or 16 when I first found that first Pride tape of the 2011 Grand Prix. So unfortunately, no, I never got to attend. But yeah, certainly the Ryzen show I was at. I mean, the entrances, the initial setup, you know, Lena Hart's introductions, all these things, you know, that was just like I'd seen on TV, and that was really amazing for me. So, although I didn't get to see, the stars in their prime, I felt like I did go to a Pride show because it clearly mirrors so many different elements of Pride there.
One of the things that Pride was trying to push, I think it was about 2006, about a year before they closed, was bringing in Mike Tyson. I know there had also been rumors of him fighting in K1 against Bob Sapp. I think they even met in the middle of the ring and had a face-off. And
Oh yeah, I remember
uh,
that.
they were kind of pushing that idea, and then Pride kind of became rumored to be bringing in him, and he's not eligible to fight in Japan because of his criminal record. So they were talking about doing it in China. Um, do you know much about that? Do you know if that was ever actually close to coming to fruition?
Uh, these specific instances, I couldn't say. I know K1 like really tried very hard to get him at various points. I think we're quite close. Obviously, maybe at that point where there was a face off. But one thing that absolutely happened was Mike Tyson, pretty much from Takada onwards, was a reoccurring theme in Japan. So Takada claimed that he could beat Mike Tyson. And then after that, you had various points where, for instance, at one point, I believe Hoist came over to hold a press conference before Pride 1. This is when there was a bit of a split between Hickson and Horion, who was managing Hoist at the time. And they claimed that they challenged Mike Tyson to a fight as well. K1 obviously consistently did it. When Mark Hunt wanted to go to Pride, K1 offered him Mike Tyson. At various points he's the real white whale, I think it's fair to say, of Japanese MMA and Japanese pro wrestling, where his name has just continuously been invoked. So I can't say it was ever close. I think I didn't get much more information on that, unfortunately, but I do know that it's something that's consistently tried down through the years, whether it was by Pride or by K1, to try get him interested and try get him in there.
All right, cool. So we're about to wrap it up here, but I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on, and why don't you let folks know where we can follow the progress of the book. The link for the Indiegogo is going to be in the YouTube description as well as the podcast description, but just let folks know where we can keep up with the progress and where they can pick it up and when the official release date and stuff like that.
Cool. So yeah, right now we're running an Indiegogo campaign. The reason why is because we have a professional illustrator who's done some really cool images for the book. So we've got to pay him. We've got to pay affiliate fees and like that, as well as the fact that we wanted to sort of give people a chance to get it a bit earlier and also to get a unique copy of the book. Each copy of the book that's on the Indiegogo will have a cover exclusive to the Indiegogo campaign, and we've also got some other cool rewards in terms of custom made illustrations, prints from the book. Signed copies of the book, that kind of stuff as well. It's €10 for the ebook, it's €20 for the hard copy, and you can see the various other tiers there. The place to go to is beforeafallbook.com. Right now we're 33% funded. We've got about another 2 weeks to go. These things pick up towards the end. I'm pretty confident that they'll get there, but obviously I have said it is an all or nothing campaign, so I don't get the 5K unless we reach 5K. So if people are able to donate and to support, I'd really appreciate it. And like I said, people get some pretty awesome rewards for that. So it's beforeafallbook.com. The Twitter handle is beforeafallbook. The Facebook is also beforeafallbook as well. So pretty easy to remember.
Cool. Well, again, thanks so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. I don't know if Matt, you want to close with anything with Mr. Daly before we're done?
No, I mean, it's been great having you on. Getting a chance to talk about the history of Pride is something that we always talk about wanting to do, and getting the opportunity is cool. It's one of those things where it's nostalgic for me, and one of the for a 5 or 6 year span was one of the funnest times I've ever had being a fan of the sport, was bouncing between UFC and Pride. So really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully everything goes well with the book, and actually look forward to reading it and gaining some more knowledge on one of the greatest sports organizations of all time, in my opinion.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Really, really great conversation, and thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for coming. Just for folks listening on, please follow us on at Combat Hour on Twitter. You can follow Matt at MMA Hawk 21. I'm Car Basil, and thank you again. Special Sunday edition of the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. Thank you all for tuning in.